Hello, my name is Ivan Taylor, and I'd like to talk to you today about um, system archetypes and their solutions applied to cybersecurity. I'll talk about feedback loops, and then I'll use those feedback loops to categorize various system archetypes. I want to talk about some examples of system archetypes and possible solutions to the problems created in those archetypes. I'll talk about applications to cybersecurity. I'll have some conclusions and future work. Feedback loops are central to systems thinking. However, there's only two types of feedback loops. There are reinforcing feedback loops and balancing feedback loops. System archetypes are generally based on two loop dynamics, where you have a loop for intended consequences, and then you have a loop for unintended consequences. And generally, these archetypes focus on the unintended consequences that occur when trying to achieve intended consequence. So they tend to dwell on the negative aspects of these solutions. There are four possible configurations of the two-loop dynamic. So with two types of loops, balancing and reinforcing loops, and also you have the idea of intended consequences and unintended consequences. There's 2 times 2 combinations of those to give you 4 configurations for possible archetypes. The first archetype I want to talk about is underachievement, where the intended consequence is a reinforcing loop and the unintended consequence is a balancing loop. Two famous examples of underachievement archetype are limits to growth, which became famous with Jay Forster's work in the early 1970s, and the tragedy of the commons, which became famous with a paper in the field of economics in the 1960s. Uh, in the underachievement archetype, there is an outcome in the center, and then there is an action that will control the relative outcome. And so the more the outcome, the more the action to control the relative outcome, the more the action to control the relative outcome, the more the relative outcome. However, the more the relative outcome, the more reaction there is in the system. And then the more reaction, the less the outcome. So we have a reinforcing loop here in the intended consequence and a balancing loop here in the unintended consequence. And for an example, a classic limits to growth problem is where you're trying to achieve some performance, and this performance you're trying to achieve leads to the application of more effort, which leads to more performance. But the performance leads to a limiting action, possibly created by some kind of resource constraint. And the more the limiting action, the less the performance. So here's a solution to the limits to growth problem, is to connect the action to the resource constraint. So here we have sales, which we're trying to maximize. However, that creates more orders, and more orders create more sales. However, more orders will increase the production lead time, which will decrease the number of orders in the long term. So that leads to a conflict. And the way to resolve this is to connect the sales to the manufacturing capability. So more sales leads to more manufacturing capability, and more manufacturing capability leads to less production lead time. The tragedy of the commons is a very common problem where we have some achievement of some reward that's desired, and you have some activity which gives you some reward, and the more reward you get, the more activity you undertake. However, the reward leads to a use of resources. So the more reward you achieve, the more resources you use, and the more resources you use, the less reward you're able to achieve. And similarly, the way to resolve this problem is to connect the action to the constraint. So here we have pleasure that is trying to achieve, say, from a national park, and that creates visitors to the national park, and then the visitors obtain pleasure from the nature in the park. Um, and then, however, that pleasure results in damage to the nature, which leads to less pleasure. And the way to do that is to control the visitors to use the visitors to control the land available, and therefore reduce the damage that's done to the natural environment. In cybersecurity, we might talk about this defined need for security, which leads to more security provided. And then we might have having successful security provided leads to the idea that we can achieve more security. However, the security provided may reduce the money available for security, and reducing the money available for security will reduce the security provided. And the way to control this is to link the need for security to the budget, and then have the budget improve the availability of money for security. The second archetype I want to describe is called relative control, where we have an intended consequence of a balancing loop and an unintended consequence of a balancing loop. And two examples of this are escalation and drifting goals. So in the relative control archetype, we have an action by A to control the relative outcome, and that leads to control of the relative outcome for A, which leads to less action to control the relative outcome. However, by increasing the relative outcome for A, there's some kind of a compromising reaction, possibly by another player like B, and then more of the compromising action leads to less of the relative outcome for A. So here's an example of an escalation problem where A's action is to gain an advantage, and then with that action, they have an advantage they gain, and with more advantage, they have less action to gain more advantage. However, the more advantage that is gained by A, the more reaction that B has to that advantage, and therefore the less advantage that A will have. So here we have two balancing loops connected. And the example of escalation is the classic example is an arms race, where you have A's arms productions leads to A's superiority, which leads to potentially less arms production. However, A superiority leads to more production of arms by B, which leads to less superiority by A. And the way to resolve this is to set an absolute target for the stockpile and look at a balancing loop that relates to the production and the achievement of the actual stockpile. And then when the actual stockpile, absolute stockpile is obtained, then you can reduce the arms production. The second example of a relative achievement, relative control problem is drifting targets. So here we have action restraining the ability to reach a relative target, and that increases the distance from the relative target, which leads to possibly less action to restrain the ability to reach the target. However, the distance from the relative target leads to a reduction in the relative target, which leads to less distance to, to the relative target. So we have this target that is reducing in time because we're not reaching the target. And the way to resolve this problem is to have an absolute target. So here we have quality initiatives, and we have the quality initiatives increase the quality relative to the target, which reduce the need for quality initiatives. And then the reducing the the relation to the target will change the need for planned quality, and that will reduce the distance relative to the target. And the way to resolve this is to have an absolute target for quality, and then look at a balancing loop where the quality initiatives are improving the quality to reach the absolute target. And then if the absolute target is reached, you can remove the quality improvement initiatives. In terms of cybersecurity, this could be a problem where, for example, the need for better security leads to just better hackers. So we have the need for better security leads to a security advantage. However, and the security advantage then leads to less need for better security. However, the security advantage leads to better hackers, and better hackers leads to less security advantage. And the solution to this problem is to hire the hackers. So we have this concept of red teaming, where we look at the need for better security, and that leads to some red teaming, and the red teaming leads to more need for better security. Now, the next archetype I want to talk about is the out of control archetype, where the intended consequence is a balancing loop, but that creates an unintended consequence, which is a reinforcing loop. And here we have 3 examples of fixes that fail, shifting the burden, and accidental adversaries. So in terms of the out of control archetype, we have a control action, which leads to a problem in the need for control, less of a problem in the need for control, which leads to more control action. And this control action leads to a system reaction, which leads to more of a problem in the need for control, and then more of a control action in a reinforcing loop. So in fixes that fail, we have a fix, and we have a problem. So the better the fix, the less the problem, the less the problem, the less the need for the fix. However, the fix creates a new problem or problem growth, which leads to more problems and therefore more need for fixes. And here's an example of how to resolve the fixes that fail problem. So we have, say, high reported crime, which leads to more police recruitment, which leads to lower reported crime. However, the police recruitment leads to overcrowded courts and prisons, which leads to higher reported crime, which leads to more police recruitment in a vicious cycle. And the way to stop this pattern is to link the reported crime to the courts and prisons to reduce the overcrowding, and then that will resolve the problem here, the fixes that fail. Shifting the burden is another similar example where, for example, we have a real problem and we have a temporary fix. So the more real problem, the more temporary fix. The more temporary fix, the less the real problem. However, the temporary fix does not improve the fundamental problem, the fundamental solution to the problem, and that leads to more continuing real problem. And so, for example, here's an example of a solution to a shifting the burden problem where we have a problem child and as a parent, we give that child treats and more problems this child creates, the more treats they're given, and the more treats they're given, the less of a problem they are. However, giving treats is not solving the fundamental problem of spending time with the child. And by not spending time with the child, you increase the problem behavior. And so the way to resolve that is to connect the problem child and spending time with the child in a way that improves the time spent based on the behaviors. In cybersecurity, we often have a problem with weak passwords, and that leads to some concepts of requiring changes regularly to the passwords, and that leads to maybe less weak passwords. However, that creates a problem of users forgetting their passwords, which leads to potentially short-circuiting the problem and creating more weak passwords. And the way to resolve that is to get around the whole thing by possibly creating a new technology such as facial recognition or fingerprinting to ensure that we don't need we don't have these weak passwords. The relative achievement archetype has an intended consequence that's a reinforcing loop that leads to an unintended consequence, which is also a reinforcing loop. And the classic example of a relative achievement archetype is the success to the successful. And here we have the general flavor of the archetype, where we have A's action to achieve a relative advantage, and that leads to A's relative outcome, which leads to a better achievement of the relative advantage. However, A's relative outcome leads to a negative impact on B's relative outcome, and that leads to an increase of the performance of A or the outcome for A. And here we have an example of a solution for this successful problem. So here we have big company sales, which lead to monopoly profits and lead to more big company sales as the profits are reinvested. However, the monopoly profits leads to less success possible for small companies, and less success for small companies leads to more monopoly profits. And the way to resolve this is to introduce some kind of antitrust regulation. So more profits leads to more antitrust regulation, which leads to smaller big company sales. And in the cybersecurity world, the solution can be applied to the successful archetype. So, for example, if we're looking and we buy a security solution based on a brand name, that brand name becomes more popular, and therefore we will buy more from that brand name. And possibly by the brand name being more popular, we miss the opportunity to buy a better security solution from a smaller company, which leads the smaller company to be less successful and leads the brand company to be more popular. And the way to resolve this is to buy your security solutions based on capabilities, which leads to a balancing loop here. So I hope I've shown you how system archetypes work. And I want to emphasize that many times systems thinking has a reputation for identifying problems and not solutions. So we've seen that the system archetypes have these ideas that you're trying to achieve an intended consequence, and that creates an unintended negative consequence. And however, what's lesser known about these archetypes is that there are solutions to these problems that can ensure that the intended consequences are achieved and minimizing the unintended consequence. And I've noted that cybersecurity has many problems and needs durable solutions, not solutions that create more problems. Now, the future work, we want to operationalize these concepts using agent-based modeling and system dynamics. And we're thinking that agent-based modeling might be very effective for offensive cybersecurity actions, and system dynamics might be very suitable for defensive cybersecurity solutions. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be very happy to talk to you about this more in the future, and you can reach me at this email address.